speaker of our last session of today. Ulrich Baer is from the New York University. He received his BA from Harvard in 1991, and then his PhD from Yale in comparative literature in 1995. And he started working with NYU as assistant professor in 1996. Currently, he's a professor of comparative literature and German, but he also works in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Diversity. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this correctly. You can afterwards correct me. He also has been, since 2014, the co-director of the Center for the Humanities at the university, which is interesting because within this capacity, performing this job, he has enhanced several activities, dynamizing research, teaching, and other professional activities among students and staff, and also coordinating the arts and humanities in all New York University institutes. Ulrich Baer is also a widely known, I must add, published author, editor and translator, expert on poetry, but not only, literary theory, photography, and has published extensively on this and other topics. Among his books, we can find related to literature and translation around Rilke's work, the Rilke Alphabet, Rainer Maria Rilke, Letters of Life, Hannah Arendt's Zwischen den Disziplinen, The Claims of Literature, a co-edition, Remnants of Song, Trauma, and the Experience of Modernity in Baudelaire and Paul Celan. And he also published The Photography of Trauma, an MIT Press edition, which probably interests us the most for this session of today, that articulates reflections on trauma, psychoanalysis, and photography, linking photographic images and trauma in a broad sense. But photography here does not appear as a topic. It picks up, it connects, it intertwines with other things, namely the importance of memory. That is, there's an elaboration, a work on the disjunction between seeing and knowing that resulted from Holocaust. Ulrich Baer in this book examines photos of the return, post-memory documents, and the way unconscious can be structured like a camera. Today we are going to listen to a lecture that has the title of Haunting Images, Ghostly Photographs in the Age of Global Media. Ulrich, this is up to you now. If you need something, we're on this side. Thank you so much for your presence. It's a pleasure to receive you here today. Thank you, really.
Thank you so much, Maria, for introducing me, and obrigado por me convidar. And I'm really sorry I cannot speak and give this talk in Portuguese, but I'm really happy to be invited, and I've been able to listen to most of the talks. They start kind of early for me because I'm in New York City. But I thought I'll try something in the beginning, because I would love to have a bit of a conversation. I have a very long paper I could read, but instead I'm going to actually present a few images to you and a couple ideas of how to think about what we are supposed to do with spectral images of a past that hasn't been put to rest properly. And I'll start out by saying that my question connects directly to the previous panel, to the question that Matthew raised in a somewhat cautious way about these juxtaposed histories of the present, which have huge amounts of images in succession. And you could say, sort of, I think the question there was, is this a productive way of making us be part of a history that hasn't gone away and hasn't been settled? And you could put on the one hand, Godard, Histoire du Cinéma, Walter Benjamin, Krakauer, Brecht, who are optimistic about the capacity of people to find meaning where it has been obscured through the juxtaposition and jarring juxtaposition of images. And then Matthew also said, but it could also become kind of a failure that doesn't realize that we are being manipulated. Like Godard, Benjamin, Krakauer, Brecht, they all knew we were being manipulated, but had the kind of optimism to think we can educate ourselves to see images on our own terms, which was also the question from the audience member. And then you could say on the other side, there's Adorno, who's a pessimist about images and says images will manipulate us or blind us. They will not be spectral, but rather spectacular and kind of just fascinate us and blind us. So that's a question I would have about what to do with historical images. And I'll show you a few images. And it also connects to Temenuga's presentation as well, where she raised the question whether the use of Holocaust images and figures or allegories or metaphors is appropriate to address today's concerns. And I understand the wariness to use another historical episode and moment that is really incommensurate to explain today's crises. So the question there was, does the Holocaust furnish tropes or allegories or metaphors that allow us to understand today's problems and challenges, or even possibly even solutions, opportunities? And the difficulties, how do you think of reality outside of already allegorized, already turned into an image, already a metaphor? So I would raise this question, and I would really love to have a conversation about this, whether history is always an act of interpretation, of putting things in order, sequence, and relation, and whether using the allegory of a particular event, say the French Revolution, or the emancipation of American enslaved people, or the Holocaust, is a problem in itself if it actually moves people in the present. So I'm kind of interested in what kind of feelings are created in addition to the cognitive, intellectual work that images can do. And I'll start you out by share a video, because it gives you a sense of what's at stake, I believe. Let me try to find this video here. So, and this is a moment from 1993 where Toni Morrison, the author, the American author, who ultimately won the Nobel Prize, reads from her novel Beloved, which is a ghost story about a young woman whose mother, who was enslaved before the American Civil War, murdered her own 2-year-old child rather than have that child be returned into slavery. It's based on a true story, Margaret Garner, and Toni Morrison takes the story of a mother who rather kills her child than allow her child to grow up as the property of white people. And then she turns it into a novel. And I'll let you listen for a moment to Toni Morrison, who I had the great joy and privilege of meeting through my friend Mantia Diawara for a few times at NYU. So here's Toni Morrison. I'll try to share the screen and you get the sense of her voice here. Let me just get to, I hope this will all work. And you have my screen now, I think, right? Yes, and let me see. And here's the interviewer, and then Toni Morrison will come and we'll listen to this for about 2 minutes. This is Toni Morrison reading from a moment in Beloved of really America's ghost returning in the present.
Need to make Beloved's ghost understand it.
Setha was trying to make up for the handsaw. Beloved was making her pay for it. But there would never be an end to that. And seeing her mother diminished, shamed and infuriated her. Yet she knew Setha's greatest fear was the same one Denver had in the beginning, that Beloved might leave, that before Setha could make her understand what it meant, what it took to drag the teeth of that saw under the little chin, to feel the baby blood pump like oil in her hands, to hold her face so her head would stay on, to squeeze her so she could absorb still the death spasms that shot through that adored body, plump and sweet with life. Beloved might leave before Setha could make her realize that worse than that, far worse, was what baby Suggs died of, what Ella knew, what Stamp saw, and what made Paul D. tremble, that anybody white could take your whole self for anything that came to mind, not just work, kill, or maim you, but dirty you so bad you couldn't like yourself anymore. dirty you so bad you forgot who you were and couldn't think it up. And though she and the others lived through and got over it, she could never let it happen to her own. The best thing she was her children. Whites might dirty her all right, but not her best thing, her beautiful, magical best thing, the part of her that was clean.
Toni Morrison.
So what I want you to think about is a few things. First of all, we just had Toni Morrison be present, which is itself kind of a haunting. And Toni Morrison has now, of course, become, due to the Nobel Prize and her achievement, kind of the voice of literary America in the 20th century. And she brings us a novel of a mother who's re-encountering the child she murdered. And in this way, Toni Morrison wants to bring into America a memory of enslavement and of the horrors of slavery into American consciousness. So Morrison's whole project as a writer is to bring into consciousness of America, into the conscience of America, of white America and Black America, what happened here. So she frames this, and there's been a kind of discussion, there are many discussions about this. Toni Morrison herself said, this is a ghost story. Beloved shows up as a character in the book as an 18-year-old girl, but she has knowledge that she couldn't have otherwise. This is a ghost returning. And the thing I wanted you to hear is when the mother remembers killing her own child and the ghost returns, the ghost is terrifying, haunting, voracious, excessive, sexually aggressive. She becomes a presence in this house that takes over that house of these people. And the one thing the mother is afraid of, that the ghost will leave. So I want us to think about spectral images as kind of bringing a knowledge into the present that is terrifying, upsetting, unsettling, uncomfortable, threatening. And yet, Toni Morrison says, it's the one thing we want to hold on to. So what Morrison wants to say, that spectrality is nothing positive. It's not good, we welcome it, like, oh, the past is with us today, we remember the dead. But it's haunting, and yet Morrison says it's necessary to endure this kind of sort of re-traumatization, if you will. So I'll share another screen here and I'll get to sort of what I'm trying to understand. And my question really is with you, to ask you to think, what does it mean to live with the presence of a ghost in your culture or your house? So I'll say this is the quote from Beloved, which we just heard. So my question in this presentation is really to welcome the ghost rather than to banish the ghost, to exorcise the ghost, and for what purpose? And I can say that for a long time, I thought the purpose is to remember, to make whole, to make amends, to repair, to achieve justice, and to tell the truth. All of these are separate and different phenomena, and all of these are kind of questions I'm having now. And I went back to the book that was referenced called Spectral Evidence, where I looked at memory of the Holocaust as mediated through photography. And in that book, and I'll give you an example of this, I really thought that the purpose of some of these images and these artistic works is to remind us that certain things are not over, haven't passed, that certain catastrophes like the Holocaust has not been absorbed into kind of contemporary awareness, and that memory may suffice. And here is where I started thinking for this conference here, that I used to think that actually remembering the dead who have not been properly buried or commemorated is enough. And now I'm in a different place, and I would be curious what people think. What is the purpose, or what can you do with a ghost? So one, and on this slide, it would say to remember, to make whole maybe something that has been amiss, which is to mourn, to bury, to acknowledge the dead. To make amends, in Beloved, the mother tries to make amends with her daughter who she murdered, to make amends and to repair. And I use these two words in a very specific sense, and I would really be curious about what people think. Because in the American context, the North American US context, the question about the proper commemoration of enslavement and slavery leads very quickly to a question of reparations, of actual financial payments. So it's not just commemoration, but it's also commemoration. It's not just to correctly remember the past, but also to make amends through reparations. As you all know, part of the commemoration of the Holocaust through the states of West Germany and East Germany for a long time were reparations, which were fiercely debated and contested in the state of Israel. There were a lot of Israelis who did not want to accept reparations because they said you can never make amends. So my question is, what do you do with a ghostly presence or a spectral image? How do you actually incorporate it into the body politic or one's life? So I'm going to go on here. Let me see, where am I on my screen here? Let me. So this is the next one. And I'll give you some pointers. These are just pointers. Walter Benjamin sort of has a lot of these thoughts of what do you do with a proper historical memory? It should transform not the past, but also our present. This is in the thesis on the philosophy of history. And I'll give you the word of caution. I'm putting this quote by Benjamin in because it's such an impossible desire. A chronicler who recites events without distinguishing between major and minor once acts in accordance with the following truth. Nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. Up to this point, I think a lot of people would subscribe to this and say, yes, we have to remember everybody who's been lost. We have to remember those who had no voice. We have to remember those who were vanquished by the forces of history. We have to uncover the gaps and blind spots and lacunae in the archives. But then the next sentence, Benjamin's is very complicated. To be sure, only a redeemed humanity receives the fullness of its past. And this is a really important question of who are we to think we have to remember everything. Benjamin says we only can remember everything if we have been redeemed, by which I think he means something very specific. And we can go to that. What does it mean for us today to absorb or to know all of history rather than just continue to repress certain parts? So is the point to discover the ghosts of the past and properly remember them? And as I said, in my earlier work, I kind of thought that's enough, that to remember the past and the ghosts is enough. And now I have some doubts whether my project there was somewhat naive maybe, or kind of short-sighted. So the question is, what would it mean for the past to be redeemed? And here, just a pointer, what I was trying to do in my work for a long time now is to sort of think about images that change us from mere observers. Maybe this is a bit what Matthew was talking about with Curtis, or also Temenuga was talking about how there's a kind of leveling and a lack of distinction between different events, which actually numbs the viewer rather than a kind of presentation of images that turn us into active participants and witnesses. So I make a distinction usually between observers who are passive recipients and witnesses who are active viewers. My idea, and this is sort of the background of this, was always that pictures bear testimony or bear witness as much to where they happened and what happened to when they happened. But the pictures I'll show you, and I'll just go through 5 images. They're not just 5 images, they're quite upsetting and unsettling, and I'm aware of that, so I'll show you those now. So this is the first one right here, where I want to sort of show you, I have to do this pretty quickly, but I think I can do this without doing total injustice to what's at stake here. And I want to also note that everything I'm saying here, and I'm going to talk about 4 major events: American slavery and 400 years of racial oppression, the Holocaust, the situation with refugees in Europe, and a specific situation in the 1990s in Sudan, which was a famine in which countless people died because of probably the inaction of other nations to help them. I want to stress here that I believe these events are incommensurate. They cannot be compared easily. And yet, I think it's kind of our obligation to think, what does that mean to have singular events that are not paradigmatic for other events, and nonetheless we may be able to understand something from them. This is a question I think that was raised in the previous presentation. And then here's a picture taken officially by a Nazi official who was assigned to the so-called ghetto in Łódź in Poland in 1943, where many, many Poles from all over Europe were incarcerated, imprisoned for a long time until most of them were murdered in various camps around there. And here this Nazi official is inspecting a set of silk ties, which have probably been brought from Budapest, Vienna, perhaps Paris, perhaps Berlin, by Jews who are arriving by the trainload every day and are incarcerated into this confined area in Poland, in an industrial city, Łódź. And he's inspecting the ties while a Jewish kind of policeman is watching him. And so as the presentation this morning was talking about animism, I thought about this. So there's a filmmaker, Dariusz Jablonski from Poland in 1999. He looked at these images, which are in the Frankfurt Museum, the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt today. And he reshot these images and in a sense animated them. And I'll show you what he found. So if you look at this picture right here, you could actually see everything, even if you're on the screen right now, what's in this picture. And what he showed is right here. There's a little boy behind the fence looking out from behind these ties. And I was really interested in what we are, as viewers, supposed to make of this boy who's looking into the camera. So this is his face right here. And if you could pull this up, you could see it more. While the photographer was most likely not aware that he's capturing this boy in this shot. And I thought a lot about who this boy is looking at. And he's looking, of course, more than the Nazi photographer. He's also looking at us today. He's kind of looking through time and past time. But then I read a lot about these images, and the historians who've done amazing work basically all said, which is almost correct, nearly every one of the Jewish inhabitants of this region, of this so-called ghetto here, were murdered. There are very few survivors. There are a few survivors that we know, and we have testimonies. So essentially what the historians did in their understanding of what is historical knowledge or information, they said, everybody in these pictures will be dead who's Jewish. But this precludes this boy who's not looking at death, but looking at life. And I was really interested what a photo does that transfers this boy into our moment right here, where he's still alive, he still has hope, which historians can then say, well, but we know what happens next. The hope is rather futile. There's not a lot of hope. The outcome is kind of a foregone conclusion. Not entirely true, some people survived, but I was interested in how do you make sense of a photograph where a boy looks out at a cameraman, not knowing what will happen, because we'll never know what happened, and holding on to hope against hope. And there are a lot of testimonies that describe this, a kind of hope against hope, which is not an irrational hope, which is actually an active stance and an action. And it's not a sense of stupidity, but a kind of accommodation to impossible circumstances. So I was just interested what to do as a viewer today with a picture like this, rather than just relegating it to the so-called sweeping narrative of history and say, Holocaust picture, young Jewish boy, he will be dead, which puts us as critics in the position of those who wanted to see these people as already dead. So how do you undo this? And this is partly a response to kind of the dilemma posed by Curtis and these kinds of documentarians who work with huge montage and assemblage. A book by Georges Didier Uberman, Les Images Malgré Tout, The Images in Spite of All, is a very important book. It's about 4 photographs taken in Birkenau by Jewish inmates as part of the resistance, which Claude Lanzmann, the remarkable filmmaker and author of the film Shoah, largely dismissed and said we shouldn't see these images. And then Didier Uberman argues for an entire book that we should look at these images because these images are an act of resistance, even if they show death and defeat. That taking the pictures themselves is an act of historical action and agency and resistance. And there's this long argument between Didier Uberman and Claude Lanzmann, and I don't want to go into it, but it's quite important, I think, to think that there is a way in which filmmakers have thought, and artists have thought, one can reanimate a picture that otherwise historians will only show as death. I'm going to skip the Jablonski, and I'll show you 2 other images with the caveat that I'm not saying, but I'm raising the question that Temenuga raised a minute ago, or half an hour ago. Here's a very famous photograph from the Warsaw Ghetto, part of the Stroop report. It's a very famous photograph, widely reproduced, about Jews being forced out of a hiding place by Nazi soldiers. The identity of this Nazi is actually known. The identity of this boy has become the subject of many books, and it's not entirely clear. And it has become a very important image. And I want to stay with this for a moment because I think it puts the viewer in a position of seeing historical circumstances with a quote unquote innocent victim. When it's a child who's subjected to historical circumstance in a photograph, we are instantly kind of triggered to think, here's someone who needs our care. Here's someone who needs our assistance. We are put in the symbolic position of the caretaker or parent. That's why pictures of children are immensely important and effective. And I'm gonna just say it like this right now, and I would love to hear what people think. What does effective even mean? This picture did effectively nothing for these people, but it is an important image in a kind of history. And I'll show you another one. These images are quite upsetting, so I'll just tell you this, and I'll say something about that. This is Kevin Carter's very famous photograph that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1993 of a young boy in Sudan during a famine. He was trying to reach a feeding station by the United Nations. He actually did reach this feeding station, but this photograph won the Pulitzer Prize to exemplify and draw attention to a crisis that was happening in full view of the world without the world intervening sufficiently. There's a vulture in the background. It's a kind of foreshortened perspective. The vulture is not as close as one would think. The boy will survive. Kevin Carter, the photojournalist from South Africa, who was part of a collective, the Bang Bang Collective Against Apartheid, committed suicide 4 months after this picture was printed because he was criticized so harshly for not intervening, but instead just taking a picture. And many of you will remember Susan Sontag's kind of sort of these issues. Photographers don't act or intervene, they just take images. So Kevin Carter, the photographer whose life was committed to bring attention to these horrendous situations to get help, was actually criticized so harshly for other reasons. So this is a very well-known photograph. And I want to draw your attention to these kinds of images that resonate in the public and ask, my question is really, what can they do? What can they motivate and prompt? And I'll show you another picture. And all of these pictures, as I said, are upsetting. I'm aware of this. I've been teaching photography for a very long time, and I've come to think that if you're upset by this image, it's a somewhat displaced emotion. You should be upset by the reality that is depicted and not by the photograph itself. I'll show you this next picture here. Wait, this is Alan Kurdi, photographed by Nilofer Demir, September 2015 on the beach of Lesbos, a really upsetting image, a devastating image of this young Syrian boy who drowned along with his mother, trying to reach Greece from the Syrian crisis. And I move on here to, just to give you a space, and I really would like to hear what people think. I teach photography a lot, and I find it very difficult to teach these images, also because now we live with PowerPoints and 12 by 15 feet depictions, and I don't like to have these images up because they situate us, all of the room right now in Porto, but also everybody in Zoom, they situate us in relation to this image in different ways. We are differently affected. We're not all seeing it in the same way from the same place. I think that is the power of images, that actually there's an image out there, but it also places us in relation to it. So here's Ai Weiwei, a Chinese artist, picture by Rohit Chawla, which he took a few weeks after this on the beach in Lesbos, and he puts himself in the position of Alan Kurdi. It's a controversial image, and I'm going to end with it. I have a lot of other things I could bring up, but I want to ask two questions about this. The first one is that my initial impulse had been, as I said, that when you encounter a ghostly or spectral image, your obligation is to acknowledge something that happened, which is usually traumatic or catastrophic. And that means it's contested. It doesn't have one interpretation. It doesn't also just have many interpretations, but it has conflicting interpretations. There's a contest of meaning resulting from this event. There are different perspectives on it. That was my question about the presentation this morning, is that, of course, not all memory is traumatic. And I was thinking about this quite a lot this morning when Jose was presenting some memories, not traumatic, but I'm interested in these pictures here. And traumatic memories, meaning memories whose meaning is still contested, both for the people who lived through it and for bystanders, participants, and those and perpetrators. So the contestation is an openness. Secondly, I want to ask whether the controversy around Ai Weiwei putting himself into this picture really challenges my idea that to commemorate the dead who haven't been properly mourned, to know that they existed, that they suffered, that this happened to them is sufficient and enough. Because I think what Ai Weiwei is drawing our attention to, and my colleague Hental Yap at NYU has just written a book called Minor China, where he explains this. Ai Weiwei wants to call into question or even undercut my liberal idea that commemoration and memory of Alan Kurdi, of the boy in the ghetto in Łódź, of Toni Morrison's Beloved, that this is sufficient. That by remembering, we change our present and we know this happened and now we have the commemoration and the efforts. And Ai Weiwei puts his own body into this place to signal a few things. It says that Europe, no matter how many boys drown on the shore, how many pictures are produced globally and world leaders assume the positions of parents over the Canadian Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, they all responded to this picture, to Alan Kurdi's picture, and said, I feel like a father. Ai Weiwei says, the European imagination still looks at bodies as other and different and non-European, including my body as a middle-aged, some slightly overweight Chinese man. That Ai Weiwei says, my body interrupts your liberal fantasy of humanizing the crisis. And this is a quote, I have this in my paper. CNN called the Alan Kurdi picture as it finally humanized the crisis in Syria. And what does that mean? That until then, we didn't think these people were human, we being Europeans or North Americans. And Ai Weiwei says, it's not the right thing to humanize. It's actually important to remember and register the difference that remains even in death, that there's a different body, a differently coded and seen and visible body. And Ai Weiwei's body is there in that place to say, you cannot absorb even the memory of Alan Kurdi. And Alan Kurdi then, this Syrian boy Kurdish boy has a kind of afterlife in the art world. There are many murals about him. There's a German kind of rescue ship in the Mediterranean now named the Alan Kurdi. There are all sorts of effects. And I actually think by now, it is actually good that there are these effects, that there's actually something productive, that the image is being reworked and recirculated, and Ai Weiwei opened it up. And of course, he was also criticized, say, how can you, it's blasphemy, this is befouling the death of this boy. And I think Ai Weiwei wants to stop us and say, we cannot just say, oh, now we remember him, we humanized him in our liberal imaginary, now that works, we have a memory of him, but he says there's still an obstacle. And I'll end with one more image, equally disturbing and challenging us, that opens up this in a different way, which is the picture of George Floyd being murdered by Derek Chauvin, which triggered a nationwide and then global protest movement that had already been brewing and had been going on for over 200 years in America, not just 4 years, Black Lives Matter, but over 200 years of the protest of the state against its Black citizens. So George Floyd's image, which produces a global reckoning, does several things, and I'll stop right here. And then I just would love to have sort of the opening I can go on. First of all, the picture of George Floyd, the video, which we all know lasts for over 8 minutes, could have been absorbed in about 3 or 4 seconds. It takes us about 3 or 4 seconds to see and get the information from an image. The opening of time in 8 minutes has been interpreted, and I found this really powerful, by Julia Wright, who's the daughter of Richard Wright, African-American novelist who wrote Native Son. And Julia Wright said recently, my father would have been fascinated by the video of George Floyd's murder. And she said he would have been disturbed, he would have been outraged, he would have been angered, And he would have been fascinated because it is one of the few times where Black Americans can see what is done to us. Because the history of lynching is a vast history of murder of Black Americans at the hands of white people, but it is usually not seen or recorded. It's usually happens out of place. Ralph Ellison's story, A Party Down at the Square, 1950s. Gene Toomer's story in his novel, 1923 novel, Cain, both depict lynchings, which turn into celebrations and town festivals for the white population of a town when a Black man is strung up on a tree, mutilated, burned alive, cut up, and the white people celebrate and see all of it and witness it, and all the Black people disappear and hide for that day because they're in immediate danger. So Gene Toomer and Ellison, two African-American writers, show how white America has actually celebrated and seen these murders, but Black America was never allowed to watch this. So Julia Wright said, the 8.5 minutes open up time that was never available to the Black community in this way. And then my colleague, Carlos de Jesus, who teaches cinema and filmmaking here at the Tisch School of the Arts, he said, these 8.5 minutes open up 400 years of history. That time is extended, and he refers to it as kind of cinematic time. He says, nobody needs to see 8.5 minutes of this, but something is opened up that allows us that time itself needs to be filled with meaning. So I had other thoughts, and I thought I would maybe end right here instead of going on and say, the question I have really is, what do we do with such images? And I know I showed you only 4 images, but they're quite enough for me. And I actually, as a person, have a very hard time with images, which is ironic because I write about photography, but they affect me really greatly. And you also can't unsee them. So my question is, what are we supposed to do with an image of the Syrian boy? Or what are we supposed to do with the image of George Floyd? And as I said in the beginning, one action we have to take is, first of all, acknowledging that this happened. Secondly, give people the dignity of their name and of being properly remembered, not just as placeholders for something else. In every Black Lives Matter protest that I've been in and that I've seen, there's always a moment when it says, say their names, and people say the names of those people who've been murdered at the hands of police. So it's a kind of acknowledgement of individuality. But beyond that, the Ai Weiwei intervention really prompted me to rethink whether what I'm subscribing to is a kind of, for lack of a better word, I'll call it a kind of liberal mindset that say commemoration is enough. We just have to acknowledge these things happened. And once we do, then what? Which is the question that Temenuga asked in all the movies that are being made. Then what about today? We're supposed to commemorate what happened in Europe 50 years ago. So the Petzold movie, for example, which kind of scrambles these times and says, and what is happening today? It's not a blueprint for what we should do today, but it opens up a possibility to think differently. And this differently would be, to go back to Toni Morrison, would be to acknowledge that the ghosts that haunt us cannot be and should not be assimilated into our present politics. They should actually remain obstacles to this kind of absorption. They should remain stumbling blocks and continual challenges. I think Ai Weiwei does this in a very specific way, and I use this as shorthand and need to be explained. He essentially puts a racialized body into the place of Alan Kurdi and says, my own body as a Chinese man in Europe is now triggering you in Europe to say, you thought you actually did enough to commemorate Alan Kurdi, to change a few things, to have some prime ministers weigh in, but you're still treating everybody who doesn't belong because they look a certain way. So if it's okay, Maria, I'll stop right here. And I wonder if people have questions or not. I can also go on, but and thank you again for giving me an opportunity. And I've learned so much already from the last day and a half. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ulrich. It was really interesting. in a certain way, a punch in the stomach, which I found really interesting to pick up with previous communications and our day with a common reflection on action and a responsible posture in front of pictures. But I will come back to that later. I think Carlos has a question for you.
Yeah, it's more of a comment, maybe. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think it's very important to discuss this because that remind me of two ideas that are not, well, maybe they are connected. One is this topical in film studies, which is how to address certain elements after the trauma of the Second World War. So there's this tradition of people who've thought about how some memories should be hidden in the sense that they should be taken out the literal parts of the images, like the how do you say, a reflection towards objection. So there's this long tradition in film studies. No, not so long, but some that has some career with it, the way we treat with these images. And that also remind me of a film in 2015, which is called Sophia, the son of Soul, which kind of challenges, and I think it's also a little bit with the Huberman's idea, that also challenges this idea that certain elements should be relegated to the off-screen. So this, it does show the inside. It is a fiction that shows the inside of the Auschwitz camps. And it always, of course, it shows some pictorial elements, but it also works a lot with sound. But we are inside, we are transported inside this kind of a inferno. So I think it's very important to challenge this notion that kind of as you said, kind of maybe play with our liberal, comfortable minds to just put away from our eyes some of the very unpleasant realities. And also made me, your reflections made me think about the idea of Agamben, which is the profanations idea, which is sometimes there's this idea that how to go around certain preconceived and controlled use for certain objects. And I think here we could also be thinking about how we could go beyond the idea of paying homage to a certain individuality, but also expanding our actions through an image or through an event mediated through this appropriation and several categories of working with the image to expand this memory, to make it present, and to in a way to profanate, to make it to make us more active in this process that will never happen again. So thank you. It's just some remarks.
Yeah, college. Oh, sorry. There's a bit of an echo. This is really interesting, and I think what you're saying is that there had been a very long discussion of a kind of taboo or a kind of propriety or respect even for the dead, and there's a kind of profanation or transgression if you show in a way too much. Lanzmann Shoah became kind of the benchmark for a while. I remember, which seems to me just such a different technological age, when Art Spiegelman was critical of Schindler's List because Schindler's List showed too much. I think this is also in the chat right now. Alice Barden is asking a really good question, and Miriam Sampaio, about what does it mean for Black Death to become sensational and to be shown so much? And in some ways, the kind of calculations that have to be made that you're raising between, first of all, an epistemological question, is something unshowable or unrepresentable, okay, or an aesthetic question. But then there's an ethical question of who gets to show it. You know, Darnella Frazier is the teenager who shot the video of George Floyd at great risk to herself and has been interviewed afterwards. And she's been mentioned here by Alice Barton in this, or by Miriam in this conversation. who gets to show these images? And maybe the question is, I think what you're asking, who gets to have the privilege to say, I don't want to see this, this is offensive to me? I feel this is really difficult. So I showed you these pictures and I kind of gave you these kind of warnings and said, this is really upsetting. And in some ways, I think what we are going through in America right now is, this is not new to many people. That's why I said, this is a movement that started 200 years ago. It did not start, or even longer, it did not start 4 years ago, that the Black community has been forced to witness certain things. And that I don't want to kind of recreate this saying, I find it really difficult to look at this. Other people live in this. I think your question goes to this kind of ethical, who has the right to even say, and in some ways to me, I mean, I was just in awe of Claude Lanzmann. He was a very generous, I was able to translate one of his texts. I learned enormously from him. I'm really fond of Art Spiegelman. I know these people, but I kind of feel today, who has the right to kind of border control what can be shown? And this is, I think, what's new. And maybe this is also what's important for this conference. Because of cell phone videos, why would we even entertain this debate? Like, certain things shouldn't be seen anymore. They are seen and they happen all the time. So just the fact that, so in some ways, your question is really at the heart of this, maybe to turn it into who has the right to demarcate what can be shown, and this debate of what can be shown, the Son of Saul movie. I mean, that's just kind of art film stuff. I can tell you the internet is full of graphic depictions. If you type in Holocaust, the whole internet is full of horrendous, in my view, horrendous stuff, but it's like, there's no judge anymore. There's no arbiter. There's images that didn't. So in some ways, I'm interested in this question you're asking. And I think Miriam and Alice, maybe they want to come in to say, who has the right to say, I don't want to see it? Who gets to take an enormous risk to still show these images? And this is what Toni Morrison essentially did. Toni Morrison, who had to endure these idiotic questions for her entire career, where people said, why are you only writing about Black people? And she said very memorably, when someone said, why do you only write about Black people? She said, do you understand how profoundly racist that question is? And she said, no one ever asked Dostoevsky. So I'm kind of interested in that these images unsettle even these distinctions. You know what I mean? Like, they unsettle even who is the person to decide this is tolerable, this is not, this is possible, this is not. I would be curious. I mean, the people in the chat, maybe because not everybody in the room can probably see the chat, would be interested if you want to come in.
Can I ask a question? Can I say something?
Margarida, go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrich, for your wonderful presentation in issues. I have the same problem when teaching about images, because I even had a class of photojournalism, and I was remembering Alan Sekula, a statement that photojournalism is a kind of capitalist subproduct. I just noticed something you said. I think it's really important. It's very different, because to have time, to have 8 minutes to see that kind of photograph, because the problem of images and photojournalism in general since the 20s is they are always fast photography. We see them very fast, and we seem very tired and very consumed by such horror. We get a kind of anesthetized by such images, and people say what you're saying. Oh, I don't want to see such an horror. It's horrible things. I don't want to see them, and we don't have the right. But the problem of the circulation of image is the time, isn't it? That what you have just pointed. They are normally seen too fast. They don't stay with us.
But I think, Margaret,
they're running.
It's a really good question, but I think
like cars in a running car.
But your work is kind of on this kind of idea of animism or animation, which is also the relation between stasis and some other state of putting things in motion means they exist through time. And I think what I liked about the Ai Weiwei picture, which a lot of my friends don't like at all and found really offensive, said it opens up the time of this photograph again. It kind of makes us re-see it. And I do think the work that has to be done, which is the work of a conference like this, not to make us look too exciting or something like that, we're just academics and creators, but the people in these rooms right now who are photographers and filmmakers and creative people, I think it's vitally important to go to older other existing images and open them up again, or in your language, maybe to animate them. Like, there's something about even the Disney, what Eisenstein, which is the magic of Disney, that it animates life which is dead to us, because the past is always dead to us. I think this project of animating and creating time is vitally important. I remember I studied, I was really fortunate, I had really amazing teachers. And so Shoshana Fellman was one of my teachers who did really seminal work, which really influenced me on witnessing. And Jean-François Lyotard was one of my teachers. And he said, yeah, but when the stormtroopers, whoever is breaking down your door, you can't deconstruct your way out of it. And I said, but Jean-François, that's never the argument. And he said, yeah, but it becomes the argument. He was sort of furious with academics who are sort of too much indulgent. And then I said, but then it's too late anyways. And he said, yeah, the problem is that much of our life, we don't take enough time, that only in moments of crisis do we know we don't have enough time. And then Lyotard said, but in the moments when we don't have a crisis, we just don't even know we have time. Mm-hmm. So he said, art opens up time in a different way. So I think your question is the time, and this is what I said, what Julia Wright, who is Richard Wright's daughter, said about the George Floyd video. It opens up time when people were never given time to remember or to actually acknowledge what happens. So time is a space to do something then. So I think your question is quite closely linked to the kind of ethics of images.
Yeah.
I, however, as I just did, I actually had a really hard time showing you these images for so long. I find it really difficult, and I find them really unsettling, and I can't unsee them in my mind. So I have a really hard time with them. And as I said, they're seen differently by different people. I mean, if you're a teacher as well, you know, some images will actually create a disturbance in the room, and some people suddenly are positioned in certain ways, and that's not necessarily a good thing.
Maybe because they are traumatic images, like Bart used to say. And they are very difficult to talk about because they are very challenging of our profound feelings and our sense of dialectic of life and death. And
I think that's the kind of task we have, and I think that's what Matthew's presentation was about also a little bit. How do we create the opportunity to respond, especially for people who are silenced by images, and especially for people who are not given that time normally? How do you actually create the space? And I wonder if these kind of montage projects are in some ways in a weird way, they're overwhelming, but they also open up spaces. Mm-hmm. You're just absorbing so much that suddenly something opens up. That's what Benjamin's hope was with these dialectical images, that a spark opens up, something opens up. So what you're saying, I think you're right, traumatic images can silence. How do you actually turn them into an opening?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the question. How can you talk about after the silence, the first silence? How can you put them operating and changing mentalities and changing behavior? Because we always enter the faculty and everything is normal, and we don't really think about the people who are not there because they can't, Black people, different people, poor people, and it's very comfortable. We don't have images of them. I have this experience because I normally teach at 8 o'clock, and I cross with cleaners, and they are all black, all black. All the cleaners of the faculty are black. And during the day, there's very few black people in the faculty.
Where is this? Where are you teaching?
Here in Lisbon, in the Nova University.
I think this is part of what you're raising, is part of the different types of visibility, of hypervisibility and invisibility. Yeah. I think part of what we're trying to do is, and part of what's coming up in the chat is to say, how do you actually both allow for speech or thinking or something to continue after traumatic impact, but also what I wanted to raise, that I think in my book, Spectral Evidence, I had a slightly, I don't know, I don't want to call it naive, but I had this idea, okay, so as long as there's proper remembrance of these people who otherwise, in Benjamin's terms, lost to history, that's already enough. And then this Ai Weiwei project really challenges this idea of humanizing and making the same and assimilating through empathy. He says, no, I am not the same. It is not about understanding our shared humanity, but our difference, which is more like Edouard Glissant, who would say, recognize the opacity in yourself and the other's opacity. Don't say, oh, you're just like me. Say, actually, you are opaque to you and to me. So there's something here that has to be worked out, where I think in my initial book, and that's why Toni Morrison is so powerful, because that ghost is just a terrible thing in Beloved. It's just a terrible thing. This figure is and then it sort of goes away. But Morrison said, I wanted to put this into the American consciousness, this terrible thing, and also say, we have to hold on to it and even love this, because it is part of our past. That's a really hard thing to say. Like to actually love this ghost in this book, which is a child murdered by her mother. And Toni Morrison said that has to be something you hold on with love, which is virtually impossible. And I think that's what America is struggling with right now. And it goes, I mean, what we're seeing in America, there are huge efforts to prohibit the teaching of slavery, etc. It's really a very deep project of how do you account for the past in a proper way. And Toni Morrison would say, in a radical kind of love of that which you have hurt and which hurts you. Not in a simple kind of shared humanity love, but in a very radical exposure. I mean, I don't know, that doesn't answer, it's just, I keep on asking the question more than an answer, I think. But I think that work that's done in this conference is to open up these spaces. I'd be curious if, Teminuga, you think that these films which use the tropes of the Holocaust open something up productively or foreclose that, actually, whether they just say, oh, they're just rehearsing tropes, and then people have this ground to know the Holocaust is the reference point, as if that is a reference. I want to say it's not a reference that solves anything that hasn't been resolved.
I was going back to that initial remark of yours, picking up the idea of opacity, precisely because it worries me. I understand the point of having structural similarities and using Holocaust as a trope, allegory, paradigm, whatever you want to. But I think there's a huge risk of dilution in political terms. And it's also easily assimilated in an institutional discourse. Let's see, for example, the effort in European Union to create the idea of an united diversity. And there's also the risk of having this phantom of Holocaust diminishing the importance of other things. So I understand the point, but it also raised me, well, it made me think. I don't know if you want to comment on that as well. This, I think it's really dangerous to have the possibility of proximity among any kind of injustice or force or abuse, whatever it is.
I think it's really a great question, and I think it's very hard politically to not use one event is a paradigm for other events. And then the Holocaust for a while served as a kind of ultimate paradigm that can never be approached and must never, nothing. And in some ways, I think what I try to think, it is actually possible for human beings to hold things in their head that are totally incommensurate and yet analogous. That is possible. It's possible for people to think several things happen. They're not the same, but they can be related. And I think it's important to relate them, actually, maybe more in the kind of Benjaminian way, these kind of really provocative way. Godard, I mean, in Histoire du Cinéma, he juxtaposes things you sort of think they could not be next to each other. They're literally the death camps and Liz Taylor. Quite literally, because Godard realized the person who filmed the camps in Germany went to Hollywood and filmed A Day in the Sun with Elizabeth Taylor. So in some ways, your question is it a risk to use one event to explain other events, or to actually subordinate those other events and say, well, today's crisis isn't quite like that. It's something different. But at the same time, my very first question I asked is about the previous panel was, but I'm not sure we can think outside of tropes and metaphors and allegories and paradigms. So maybe it's not so unproductive to use a paradigm that at least resonates with people and say, wow, this has happened. So I'm not so completely sure that using a previous historical event as a paradigm is necessarily bad. I think it's bad from what you're saying if it then becomes a kind of argument to silence everything. Say, well, it's not as bad as that. It doesn't have the same dimensions. So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know much about this effort, what you said, the kind of united diversity effort. I'm not sure what that would actually mean.
Yeah, I was just commenting on the general politics of European Union, the general effort of trying to deal with diversity since long ago, and has, first of all, as an economical and then political project, and nowadays as a way to deal with the crisis. But I agree with you. I think establishing a measure can be really helpful, but I think it's also important to make it unstable. And when we are talking about art, thinking about the risk of kind of a common aesthetics, and picking up what you've said before and thinking about Didier Huberman and other authors that in the same way, like Arras, call attention to the non-visible points of images that are putting us responsible for embody something of it. I think that awareness can coexist with a paradigm or tropes, but still has to exist to see. And I understand, I truly acknowledge and thank for the previous presentation. I'm not criticizing at all, but I thought that as a challenge, it also has to moves you to think a Jewish, in fact, it's not a refugee, it's not a black life, and so on, right? So you always have to do this kind of movement of positioning and depositioning yourself.
No, I think you're right. And I think what I'm trying to think maybe is that these images are called spectral images. They can at least open up this discussion. So Toni Morrison prefaced Beloved, her novel, published in 1993, with to the 60 million. This was considered by many people an affront because it was measuring against the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust. And she said 60 million Africans enslaved and murdered during the Middle Passage. And Toni Morrison didn't mean to offend anyone, but to say, we can actually hold in our mind several things at once. And in some ways, I think that is very important for an artist to sort of go into this place and say, we can actually commemorate several things at once. And it's not productive to say, you must not think about this because you have to think so much about this. At the same time, the Benjamin quote I put in earlier.
You're right. Yeah.
Only a redeemed humanity can remember everything, right? Yeah. In some ways, I think what he means, Benjamin means something like what I would call a just society, and somewhat closer to a fair society. That's why I raised the question. reparations the way to go there? Is legislation, is better politicians in Europe the way to go there? I'm not sure, but Benjamin would have meant something quite concrete. He did not mean messianic, and it's quite interesting. I mean, it's an amazing section in Didi Übermann's book where he talks about Scholem, Krakauer, Benjamin. They all talk about redemption. That none of them really mean religious redemption. They mean redemption through our actions every day that we personally do, that each one of us can contribute to the redemption of the world. So what you're raising is kind of a political activism or action that's not linked to maybe just the big political programs, I think.
Yeah. If you still have time, we have several questions raised in the chat. So if you want to pick up.
I mean, I think I would just like to hear, like, I see the questions, they're really, it's kind of about the commensurability or comparability of different images. I mean, I kind of put into your mind now 4 very different events of people and stories and countries that are not the same. I'm also really interested, actually, and I would have really loved to have been in Portugal. I would really be interested how you actually receive and interpret Black Lives Matter and its relation and use to images. Because in this country, in the United States, Black Lives Matter, which was started by trans women, is really an important movement driven by the use of images, which has been a civil rights strategy for 60 years in America. But I would be curious how actually these pictures are interpreted in Europe, because they mean something different in Europe, and I don't even understand how they could actually signify the same thing. So I think some of those questions are in the chat. There's another question about the Alan Kurdi photograph about the Syrian boy. There's a huge literature now on this photograph and what happened to it and how it was used. And that's what I said. It ultimately became instantly a paradigm for something. But I think it became a paradigm for something rather limited, which is, let's humanize the crisis. This is terrible. We all feel like the dad. This is what the prime ministers of Canada, Australia, and Britain said. That is not the response, I think, and this is why Ai Weiwei's intervention is really good. It cuts that short. So, so if it's okay, Maria, maybe people want to come in and ask a little more rather than
yeah, that would be nice. If someone from the audience that is listening to us online wants to participate, can they only do it by chat, Daniel? You can ask for participate, and probably it will be clearer for us to follow your argument on voice.
And Matthew just put a question just while they're figuring out how to do this tech stuff. So he said, the best thing images can do, perhaps, is to transform the way we see the present. So it informs our perception, interpretation of everyday life. The example of the cleaners that Margarita gave, actually, that there's a real class and race difference among the people who service the universities and people study and teach in the universities. And I think Matthew's question goes to, how can images actually not humanize everything, but maybe allow us to behave differently? I think that's, at least I think that's the question that's being raised. How in our, without turning images into something so utilitarian, how can it change our daily actions in a way to, and there are many projects around this, but I think that would be a way to think about, I mean, Matthew's saying perhaps the best thing images can do. I think images can do actually quite a few good things as well. I think actually it's not bad if images reach politicians. Like I teach my students, there's in Ava DuVernay's movie Selma, which is about the bridge that during the civil rights movement, sort of a Black Americans march on this bridge, and Lyndon Johnson is the president at this time. And in the movie, in this Hollywood movie, Lyndon Johnson goes like this, and he goes on a Saturday morning and he looks at the New York Times, this is the New York Times, and he looks, God damn, because a violation of a Black woman is on the cover of the New York Times. And he says, now I have to do something. So it shifts American politics to get one picture on above the fold in the New York Times. So I think pictures can do more than change our behavior. They can actually really shape the way things are seen. So Matthew, I think you can speak now. I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah, I've been quietly sitting in the background because these questions are so profound. I didn't really know how to, especially on the chat on Zoom, I wasn't quite sure how to. I think it's really interesting discussion that you've opened up there. I myself, I come from a position of being pretty critical towards the art world in general, you know. So when you first presented us with that image of Ai Weiwei, my initial instinct was a bit like your friends, I think, which is to recoil. In part because it seems quite an offensive gesture, but in part also because, you know, I question who will that impact. You know, I mean, I'm not sure how much of an impact an image by a kind of famous artist can have on most people. You know, I'm sure it will remain. The fact that I didn't know about it is perhaps an example of that. But you have made me think that I am perhaps I should not be so pessimistic, because I can see absolutely the positives that can come from what he's trying to do, as you say, to kind of break that kind of liberal distance from the image. But the main thing I wanted to say, I'm sorry, just to be brief, is that I'm very interested, and I write a bit about the situationists, and of course they were really obsessed with dismissing all forms of images as spectacle, right? But of course, I don't really know, but I think this idea of, if we can see images and in some sense understand that this is just a continuation of time, you know, so it's not just an image that we put into a box, but it's this, but 30 years ago, and we've come through it. I think that could be really powerful. And that idea of, if that then informs the way that you look around and the things that you see and how you interpret them, I think that can be very powerful.
Yeah, Matthew, I appreciate it. I mean, I kind of wanted to just use Ai Weiwei's picture sort of to show that I think it's necessary to rework many images, as powerful and upsetting and graphic and globally circulated they are. This Ellen Kurdi image, in a terrible way, actually collapses under its own global importance right away. It's just sort of a terrible image. It's just unbearable. And then it becomes immediately consumed, humanizes the crisis. Now the prime ministers have to do something. This happened, that happened. And Ai Weiwei says, it actually doesn't do any of these things. You have to do something. I'm going to put myself and block this view in a way. My own big body is going to be here now. So in some ways, it just challenges us, I think, because I think there was a moment when you think, oh, you know, at least we can see something, because there's always this, and I asked this question yesterday of, is her name Loretta, I think, the artist who made the Kim Gordon video about driving around as an Uber driver in LA and having the death stare or something. I said, in LA, she talked about the homelessness crisis situation, lots of people living there. It's totally visible and totally invisible. I think what art can do in a good way is sometimes show this weird tension. Ellen Kurdi was seen everywhere and no one could see it. You know what I mean? Like this opening you're saying, it can open something up. I think that's actually quite important. And I had this whole very kind of fancy disquisition on the difference between spectral and spectacular, which are very close. Like some of these images are so graphic that they just become spectacular. I think the situation is very skeptical because it's just fascination, it's blinding. You look at an image, you're like, whoa, it's off. And then you're just not even seeing because you can't absorb. So how do you open that up? And I actually think, I mean, I have a couple of friends in New York who are photographers. I said, the storming of the Capitol in America on January 6th or whenever it was, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all these images have to be reworked for us. We cannot just leave them on Twitter and CNN for a moment. They have to be reworked. They have to become part of our imaginary. We cannot let them just live as a newspaper or documentary image. They have to really be reimagined. In a way, Toni Morrison took one of the most horrific things that she found out of slavery and turned it into a novel. She said, this was worth a novel. to give it that kind of time. So I think what you're saying is like, how do we have to open up time for images rather than actually let them do what you, I think, pointed out in your presentation. What they can also do, you said they can also just become kind of overwhelming, and we become powerless because we're manipulated by them. So I think a creative response would be better, like, rather than a critical response. Yeah.
Ulrich, thank you both of you. We still have another question from Miriam Sampaio, if you agree.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Hi. It's not so much of a question. Sorry, I'm not going to put myself on video. It's not so much of a question. I just wanted to answer one of Maria's quotes, what you mentioned about the Holocaust as a starting point. I think there's several issues when people are referring to the Holocaust, and I don't know if you would agree with me, Ulrich, sorry, I'm quite nervous, is that the world in itself has decided and has silenced many of the atrocities that happened in the Holocaust. And let me be clear, I'm not saying that the Holocaust of the 6 million Jews and the Roma people and homosexuals, gays and lesbians and prisoners and trans is not—
And crazy, and people with mental disturbances and so on, yeah.
Yeah, but I thank you. But as a Sephardi and as a Sephardi Portuguese Jew living in Portugal, I can tell you that I have been silenced many, many times by non-Jewish people, including academics, when I bring up the Holocaust, only because it's not about putting it on a pedestal or on a hierarchy, because I certainly don't, because I've worked with First Nations, and there's definitely a movement in Canada of equating what is happening to the indigenous communities in Turtle Island to what happened to the Holocaust. When people bring up the Holocaust and saying that the Holocaust shouldn't be used as a starting point, absolutely, it should not be used as a starting point, but you certainly cannot silence the people that were destroyed. And many of the Jews that were murdered were actually Black Jews. So there's also something that needs to be spoken about, the breaking down of what this notion of Jewishness is. In regards to the questions about the young woman who filmed or videotaped George Floyd being a Black woman and putting herself at risk, she was not in a position of privilege because she is continuously today living under death threats. So when we're looking at these kinds of images, we also have to say and think about the kind of privilege that we're in when we're seeing these images, and how does it affect, if it affects us, how does it affect the people who are actually living these experiences? And I don't know if there's other questions that you had for me, Ulrich, because you had said something about asking me something, but it's just the North America, you talked about if Black Lives Matter has affected Portugal. Black communities have been talking about racism for a very long time in Portugal. Unfortunately, white Portuguese people have not been listening very well. It's only in the last couple of years that it's happening, and mostly in academia. There's a lot of issues in terms of colonialism and the silences of colonialism and the impacts. It's also looked at as that other countries are worse than Portugal. And I think it's about acknowledging that we as Portuguese people, including myself as a descendant of Portuguese people, that we have a responsibility in acknowledging and also looking at our responsibility as living in a society and living in a city that was built on the backs of Black people as well. And so these are issues that always come into play, even when we're not looking at images, because one has to define what an image is. When I'm walking around Lisbon and I'm walking downtown in the Baixo, in the Marquês de Pombal, in the Baixo, we know that Marquês de Pombal had these buildings built by Black slaves. We talk about the images that were created during in the 50s, I believe, in Porto, which was being brought in, Black people being brought into the country and creating a zoo-like. These issues have yet to be discussed. These issues are not being spoken about. And there's the elements of spectralities, the descendants of these Black people are still living in Portugal and still having to force themselves to tell us that their experiences are valid. So there's a huge synonymous movement between what's going on in the United States and what we're responsible in Portugal, and being a Canadian, and what, as a settler living in Canada, and my responsibility living on Mohawk land, for example. And so these are all, they're also political, they're political issues, but they're also very important within the art world and in the art communities and the kind of the images that we work with. I don't know if I'm making sense, but.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I think kind of what you're saying is so vitally important in what I said. This is actually what has to happen. And I think this sometimes this can happen when such images are kind of looked at. And as you're saying, some people and communities have been looking at such images for a very long time and living these realities, and other people have been willfully ignorant. And I think this is actually why these pictures are important, because they may shift something and break through this kind of willful ignorance, that actually people will be called into a relationship to what you're saying, that there's been a presence of Black people in Portugal. There's been there's been a presence of indigenous people in New York and of Black people in New York for hundreds and hundreds of years. And why these pictures are important, to unpack them and say, why are they resonating? What are they built on? What other pictures have come before them that have not been seen by some communities? Because I do think it's quite important for the white community to see such images, because that's where power is held at this moment. And I think there's a really important shift. And I think what's productive, that images play a really vital role in these shifts right now. Really vital. They're actually really incredibly important, powerful political tools. They can also be abused, as you pointed out. They can be kind of forms of silencing, but they can also be really just open up these spaces. So I really just want to thank you. I think it's really the point of this kind of conference, I think, is to open up things in this way, not to necessarily settle them, but and not to necessarily totally unsettle them, but I think to open them up and say, we can still do something. That's what I said, yeah, so maybe that's enough. But Miriam, thank you for your comments and all the engagement, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Ulrich, I don't know if you want to do any final remarks.
No, I just want to thank you. I really want to thank everybody sort of at the conference so far, and it really gave me this great opportunity. So Daniel and Nunu is not here. Thank you for inviting me to rethink some of my own assumptions. I really think I could map it and say, oh, I wrote my book before digital became really big or something. That's just not true. I mean, it's just, but I think I was working in a certain paradigm, addressing also a different kind of political speech and private speech around commemoration and about historical atrocities. And we live in a different, we are shifting, and this paradigm has shifted. And I really, so for me, this has been a great opportunity to rethink some of my premises. I still think what Matthew said, like, people may be stupid, but they can be what's it called? They can be woken up. You know, we all can be woken up. And I would include myself in this. When Matthew said that people are stupid, I'm stupid too, of course. Like, I consume images in a dumb way. So I actually want to just thank all of you for the opportunity, and I'm gonna follow. And I don't know if I'm gonna be able to get up so early tomorrow morning. I got up at 5:30 today, I think, to watch the first panel.
It's fair. It's quite fair.
And I especially want to thank the organizers for putting academics and filmmakers and photographers into conversation. I think it's so great to have people from all different places come together. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ulrich. Once again, thank you all. Tomorrow we will start at 9:30. I want to invite you all to be with us if you can. You're allowed not to come, Ulrich. It's very early. And thank you once again for today. It was really, really interesting. really participate.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all the questions and for moderating.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.